The seat in first-class air inside the airport lounge was quiet, with only the low hum of voices and the distant clinking of coffee cups breaking the stillness. Sundar Pichai sat in a corner seat, a simple gray sweater over a plain white shirt, his glasses resting low on his nose as he read something on his tablet. He had just finished a long series of meetings overseas and was flying back home. Despite the world knowing him as the CEO of one of the biggest companies on earth, today he looked like any other tired traveler. He liked it that way. Anonymity, even for a short while, was the kind of peace he treasured. The boarding call for. First class was made, and Sundar quietly packed his tablet away, slinging his modest black backpack over his shoulder. No designer luggage, no entourage, no fanfare, just him. As he approached the gate, a tall man in a sharp navy suit gave him a quick glance, then looked away with a faint smirk. Sundar didn't think much of it at the moment. Once inside the aircraft, the warm lighting and plush seats of first class were a welcome sight. Sundar found his seat, a window spot with plenty of space, and sat down. He placed his backpack neatly by his feet and pulled out a small notebook. He often used flights to think, to plan, to sketch ideas quietly without distraction. As he scribbled a few lines, he felt a presence beside him. The man in the navy suit stopped at the aisle seat next to Sundar. His cologne sharp, almost aggressive, and his posture suggested he was used to getting his way. "Excuse me," the man said to the flight attendant nearby, his voice dripping with a mix of entitlement and annoyance. "Are you sure this is correct? I was told I'd have a more suitable seat partner." The flight attendant blinked, confused. "Sir, this is your assigned seat. Is there an issue?" The man gave Sundar a slow, dismissive glance from head to toe. "No offense," he said, though his tone clearly meant the opposite. "But I assumed first class would be, well, filled with certain kinds of people, not this." He gestured vaguely at Sundar's sweater and worn sneakers, his lips curling in faint disdain. Sundar looked up, calm and unreadable. He had faced this before. People who measured worth only by what they could see. He had learned long ago not to react to every insult. "Good morning," he said simply, with a faint smile, before returning his eyes to his notebook. But the man wasn't finished. "Must have been a last-minute upgrade," he said under his breath, loud enough for Sundar to hear. "Some people get lucky, I guess. First class isn't really for everyone." The flight attendant, uncomfortable, tried to diffuse the tension. "Sir, if you'd like, I can see if there's another—" "No, it's fine," Sundar interrupted gently, his voice low but steady. "He can sit here." He didn't want the attendant to be caught in the middle of something that wasn't her fault. The man sat down, sighing as if he had already been inconvenienced far too much. As the cabin filled, the man continued to speak, mostly about himself. Sundar learned his name was Martin, and he was a high-profile investor who liked to name-drop famous people he had met at parties. Martin asked Sundar what he did, his tone making it sound less like a question and more like a challenge. "I work in tech," Sundar replied vaguely. "Oh, like coding? Or one of those startups?" Martin chuckled. "Good for you, man. Maybe one day you'll make it up here without needing an upgrade?" He sipped his champagne as if sealing this statement with arrogance. Inside, Sundar felt a flicker of something. Not anger exactly, but a quiet awareness that some lessons in life have to come naturally. He had no desire to humiliate anyone. But sometimes truth revealed itself without effort. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Martin pulled out his phone and started loudly discussing a deal he was making sure everyone in earshot could hear. Sundar, meanwhile, opened his notebook again, jotting down a few key points for a meeting scheduled the moment he landed. He didn't need to prove himself to Martin. Still, something told him that this flight was going to be more than just a trip home. Halfway through the climb, the flight attendant approached Sundar discreetly. "Mr. Pichai, the captain said he'd like to greet you once we're at cruising altitude," she whispered. Sundar smiled and nodded. Martin heard it too. His head turned sharply. "Wait, did she just call you?" But before Sundar could answer, the seatbelt sign chimed off, and the captain's voice came through the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard. A special welcome today to one of our distinguished passengers, Mr. Sundar Pichai. Martin's champagne glass paused midair. His eyes widened slightly. The name hung in the air like a sudden change in wind. He seemed to be searching his memory, trying to place it, but his expression still carried doubt. And then the captain added, "Thank you for everything you've done for technology and for making our country proud." The cabin erupted in light applause. Martin turned to Sundar slowly, his face tight with realization. And just as he opened his mouth to speak, the flight attendant returned, this time holding something in her hands. "Sir, the captain asked if you'd like to visit the cockpit before we land." Sundar looked at Martin, his expression still calm. "Would you like to join me?" he asked. Martin hesitated, unsure whether this was an offer or the beginning of something that would change the tone of the entire flight. Asterisk. The uneasy journey. Martin's pause felt heavier than the sound of the engines outside. It was the kind of pause where someone realizes the ground beneath them isn't as steady as they thought. He adjusted his tie, his eyes darting briefly to Sundar's notebook, as if searching for clues. His earlier smugness had softened, replaced by a guarded interest. He forced a small laugh, the kind people use to mask embarrassment. Yeah, sure," he said finally. Though his voice lacked the confidence it carried earlier, the flight attendant smiled politely and left to check with the captain. Sundar leaned back in his seat, watching the clouds outside the window drift by like slow-moving ships. He could feel Martin's gaze lingering on him, but he didn't turn to meet it. Sundar had learned over the years that silence, when used well, could be louder than words. The man beside him seemed to be realizing that whatever story he had written in his head about Sundar's presence here was wrong. After a few minutes, Martin cleared his throat. "So, Sundar Pichai," he began, pronouncing the name carefully now, as if tasting it for the first time. "I think I've heard of you. You work at Google or something, right?" "Something like that," Sundar replied, his voice warm, but non-committal. He didn't want to turn this into a resume recital. He believed moments like this weren't about listing achievements, but about letting people see the human being first. Martin shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't mean earlier, what I said about upgrades. I was just..." He stopped mid-sentence, unsure how to finish it without digging himself deeper. "I guess I didn't expect to be sitting next to someone important." "Everyone is important in their own way," Sundar said quietly, still watching the sky. "Titles don't change that." The words landed heavier than Martin expected. He sat back, thinking about them. For someone who lived in a world of deals and hierarchies, the idea that importance wasn't defined by status was unsettling. The seatbelt sign pinged on briefly as the plane hit a patch of turbulence. Glasses rattled in their holders, and a couple of passengers tightened their grip on armrests. Sundar calmly set his notebook aside and took a sip of water. Martin's hand twitched slightly as he steadied his drink, trying to mask his unease. "You fly a lot?" Martin asked, his tone more curious now. "Quite a bit," Sundar replied. "Sometimes for work, sometimes to see family, sometimes just to listen to people in different places." Martin frowned. "Listen? To what?" "Stories," Sundar said simply. "People carry them everywhere they go. Sometimes they just need someone to hear them." Martin didn't respond right away. There was something disarming about the way Sundar spoke, not hurried, not trying to impress, but as if each word had been weighed and chosen. It was the opposite of how Martin usually operated, where speed and dominance won the room. A little later, the flight attendant returned, leaning in towards Sundar. "The cockpit's ready whenever you are, sir," she said, with a respectful nod. Sundar glanced at Martin again. "Come on," Sundar said, rising from his seat. "It's a rare view." Martin hesitated and followed. As they walked through the cabin, a few passengers looked up, some smiling in recognition. Martin noticed how Sundar greeted each with a small nod or a kind word, never rushing, never making it about himself. In the world Martin knew, power was shown through being untouchable. Here, Sundar's power seemed to come from being approachable. When they reached the cockpit, the captain greeted Sundar warmly. "An honor to have you on board, sir," he said, shaking his hand firmly. "I've read about your work for years." Sundar smiled modestly. "The honor's mine," he replied, then stepped aside to let Martin peek inside. Martin was visibly impressed by the sea of glowing instruments, the vast expanse of blue sky beyond the windshield, and the calm authority of the crew. On the walk back to their seats, Martin's tone had shifted again. "You know," he began, "I used to think being successful meant making sure everyone in the room knew who you were. But you don't seem to care about that." "I care about what matters," Sundar said gently. "Sometimes the things that matter most aren't the ones people see." Martin was quiet for a long time after that. The arrogance from earlier seemed to have drained out of him, replaced by a subtle discomfort, the kind that comes when someone realizes they might have been wrong for a long time. Still, part of him clung to the idea that maybe Sundar's calm confidence was just a performance. He reached for his phone again, perhaps to anchor himself in something familiar. But before he could open it, the overhead speaker chimed. A flight attendant's voice came through. "Ladies and gentlemen, if there's a passenger on board with medical training, please make yourself known to the crew immediately." The calm cabin atmosphere shifted instantly. A murmur ran through the passengers. Martin glanced at Sundar, but Sundar was already looking toward the aisle, his expression focused. A few rows ahead, a man was slumped over in his seat, a woman beside him crying out in panic. "I'll help," Sundar said too. The flight attendant, without hesitation, already unbuckling his seatbelt. Martin blinked in surprise. "Wait, you know medicine too?" But Sundar didn't answer. He was already moving quickly down the aisle, and in that moment, Martin realized this flight was about to take a turn he could never have predicted. Asterisk. The emergency at 35,000 feet. Moment Sundar reached the row where the commotion was unfolding. The noise of the cabin seemed to fade into a muffled hum. A man in his late 60s was slumped over, his breathing shallow, his skin pale and clammy. His wife clutched his arm desperately, tears streaming down her face as she kept saying his name over and over, as if saying it enough times would keep. Untethered to consciousness. A flight attendant stood nearby, visibly shaken but trying to remain calm. "Sir, please, we need space," she said to Sundar, though her tone was more plea than command. "I understand," Sundar replied gently. "I'm not a doctor, but I've seen this before. We can keep him stable until help is ready on the ground." His voice was so steady, so certain, that the panic in the air seemed to loosen its grip for a moment. He knelt beside the man, placing 2 fingers lightly against the side of his neck. "Pulse is weak," he murmured, almost to himself. His eyes scanned the small space quickly, taking in every detail. "We need oxygen, and please bring the medical kit," he said to the flight attendant. Martin had followed partway down the aisle, lingering a few rows back. He wasn't sure why he had to move closer. Maybe it was guilt for earlier. Maybe it was the raw truth that he had no idea what to do in a crisis that didn't involve money. He watched as Sundar, without raising his voice, seemed to take quiet command of the situation. The oxygen mask arrived, and Sundar fitted it over the man's nose and mouth with careful precision. "Just breathe," he said softly to the unconscious passenger, as if his voice could anchor the man to life. "You're going to be all right." He asked the wife for the man's medical history, listening attentively, never interrupting, never rushing her despite the urgency. As the minutes passed, the cabin's tension became a living thing, pressing down on everyone. People were whispering, some craning their necks to watch, others closing their eyes and silently hoping for the best. The hum of the engines felt louder now, like a constant reminder that they were trapped in the sky, far from any hospital. When the man's breathing steadied slightly, Sundar instructed the crew on how to keep him in a reclined position and monitor his pulse. His calm was almost unnerving, not because it was cold, but because it was deeply compassionate without being panicked. It was the calm of someone who had faced pressure before and learned to move through it with clarity. Finally, the flight attendant spoke over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, the passenger is stable for now. We will be diverting to the nearest airport for medical assistance. Thank you for your patience and cooperation. There was a collective exhale through the cabin, a release of a tension they hadn't realized they were holding. Sundar returned to his seat quietly, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. Martin stared at him for a long moment before speaking. How did you know what to do? He asked, his voice lower now, almost respectful. Sometimes life gives you experiences you didn't ask for, Sundar said, taking a sip of water. When my father was ill many years ago, there were moments where no doctor was near. You learn to listen, to stay calm, to do what you can until help arrives. Martin looked down at his hands, feeling a strange discomfort. He was a man who prided himself on control, on having every advantage lined up in his favor. But here, in the middle of the sky, control had nothing to do with money or influence. It came from presence, knowledge, and the willingness to help. Without hesitation, the diversion took them toward a nearby city. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, and the quiet returned. Martin sat in thought, watching Sundar jot a few more notes in his book, as if he had simply returned to his original flight plan. But Martin's mind wouldn't settle. He kept replaying the scene, the speed of Sundar's actions, the calm in his voice, the way everyone seemed to instinctively trust him in those critical minutes. After a long silence, Martin finally said, I misjudged you. Badly. Looked at him for the first time since they'd sat back down. It happens. We all see people through our own filters until something shifts them. Martin let out a slow breath. You're not like the people I usually meet in first class. Maybe. You just haven't looked closely, Sundar replied before Martin could respond. The pilot's voice came over the speakers again. Ladies and gentlemen, we are preparing to land at our diversion airport. Medical personnel will meet us on the ground. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. As the plane descended, Martin felt the weight of his earlier arrogance pressing against him. He had no idea what else this quiet man beside him was capable of, but a part of him suspected that the flight still had more lessons in store. What neither of them knew was that the landing itself would bring a new twist, one that would force Martin to confront not just Sundar's identity, but his own values in a way he had never imagined. The landing nobody planned for. Landing came sooner than expected. The wheels touched down with a gentle bump, followed by the rumble of the engine's reversing thrust. Outside the small oval window, Martin could see the blur of tarmac lights flashing past in the evening haze. The entire cabin seemed to exhale. At once, the reality of being back on solid ground softening the tension that had gripped them for the last half hour. As the plane taxied toward the terminal, an ambulance could already be seen waiting on the side of the runway. Its red and white lights pulsed rhythmically against the darkness, a reminder that what had just happened in the air had been no minor scare. The crew moved quickly, guiding passengers to remain seated as the medical team boarded. The paramedics reached the elderly man within moments, working with practiced precision. Sundar stepped aside quietly, explaining in a few calm sentences what he had observed, what measures they had taken, and the man's current state. The paramedics listened, carefully nodding, and one of them, a woman with deep lines of fatigue around her eyes, gave Sundar a small but genuine smile. You probably bought him some crucial time, she said softly. Before focusing back on the patient, Martin watched all of this from his seat, leaning just far enough to see without intruding. He couldn't help but notice that Sundar never once made the moment about himself. No grand gestures, no hint that he expected recognition. When the man's wife thanked him with trembling hands and tear-filled eyes, Sundar simply placed his hand over hers and said, "He'll be in good hands." Now, the elderly man was lifted onto a stretcher and wheeled down the aisle. His wife followed, glancing back once more at Sundar, as if silently promising to remember his face forever. Once the medics had gone, the cabin lights brightened slightly. The flight attendant made an announcement that passengers would disembark for a short period while the crew prepared the aircraft for the next leg of the journey. Most people were relieved to stretch their legs. In the terminal, the atmosphere was different. People whispered to each other about what had happened, but their eyes often flicked towards Sundar. Martin noticed that even strangers who didn't know his name seemed drawn to him, not because of celebrity, but because something in his demeanor felt grounded and steady in a world where people often moved too fast. Martin stayed close, partly because he was curious, partly because he didn't know what else to do. They stood near a quiet corner of the gate area, watching as passengers drifted toward the shops or sat down with coffee. After a few moments, a young man in an airport staff uniform approached. He looked nervous, almost hesitant, as if debating whether to speak. "Sir, are you Sundar Pichai?" he asked finally, his voice low. Sundar gave a small nod, his smile kind but modest. "Yes." The young man's eyes lit up. I just wanted to say thank you. I grew up in a small village, and my first phone was an old Android. It opened the world for me. Now, I'm studying software engineering at night while working here during the day. It wouldn't have happened without the work you've done. Martin caught the sincerity in the man's voice. It wasn't the gushing flattery he'd seen in business circles. It was raw, personal gratitude. Sundar listened intently, asking the young man about his studies, what kind of software he wanted to create, what problems he wanted to solve. By the time the conversation ended, the young man's shoulders were squared with pride, his earlier nervousness replaced by determination. Sundar didn't offer him a job, didn't hand him a business card. Instead, he told him to keep going, to stay curious, to find a way to help others the same way he'd been helped. Martin stood in silence, his mind turning over what he'd just witnessed. In his world, influence was used to close deals, to secure advantage, to create leverage. Here, influence was being used to lift someone else up without expecting anything in return. It was unsettling and inspiring. They reboarded after about 45 minutes. The cabin felt subtly different now. People smiled more easily, greeted each other with nods, and the earlier coldness of a first-class flight had been replaced with a quiet camaraderie. Even Martin noticed he wasn't carrying himself with the same rigid detachment as before. As they settled back into their seats, Martin leaned toward Sundar. "You could have told me who you were from the start. It would have shut me up pretty quick." Sundar looked at him calmly. "But then you wouldn't have really listened." Martin had no reply for that. He sat back, staring out the window as the plane began to taxi again. Something inside him was shifting, but he wasn't sure yet what it would mean. The flight took off smoothly, climbing into the night sky. For a while, the hum of the engines filled the space between them. Then, somewhere over the ocean, a new announcement crackled through the speakers. This time, it wasn't a medical emergency. It was the captain's voice, steady but carrying an unusual weight. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to a situation developing at our destination, there may be significant changes to our arrival. We will have more information shortly." Martin turned to Sundar, a question in his eyes. Sundar simply closed his notebook, his expression unreadable, as if he already suspected that the next challenge of this flight was about to unfold. Asterisk. The captain's announcement seemed to hang in the air like a low rumble of distant thunder. The usual calm murmur of first class quieted almost instantly, replaced by a subtle shift in posture and expression. People glanced toward the attendants for clues, but the crew moved with that deliberate, practiced calm that said everything, and nothing at once. Martin leaned closer to Sundar, his voice low. "What do you think it is? Weather? Security? Something worse?" Sundar's gaze stayed fixed on the seat in front of him for a moment before answering. "There are many possibilities," he said simply. "But worrying before we know the truth won't change the outcome." It was an answer that somehow calmed Martin and irritated him at the same time. He wasn't used to people who could sit so comfortably in uncertainty. 10 minutes later, the captain came back on the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've just been informed that there has been a power outage affecting major sections of the airport at our destination. Several terminals are without electricity. Arrivals and departures are being rerouted, and ground operations are limited. We will be placed in a holding pattern until air traffic control advises otherwise. A collective groan rippled through the cabin, followed by the rustle of seatbelts being adjusted and passengers digging into entertainment systems to pass the time. Martin felt his irritation spike. Delays meant missed connections, rescheduled meetings, and an overall dent in his carefully stacked day. But when he looked at Sundar, the man hadn't even shifted in his seat. He simply opened his notebook again, writing in it with slow, deliberate strokes. After nearly half an hour circling, the captain's voice returned. "We've been cleared to land, but due to the outage, we may be on the tarmac for some time before we can disembark. Please be patient." The landing was smooth, but the view outside was unsettling. The airport looked like it had been swallowed by shadows, only a few emergency lights glowing in the distance. Vehicles moved slowly along the tarmac, their headlights cutting thin paths through the dark. Inside the plane, the passengers stayed seated, restless energy crackling in the air. Soon, the crew explained that only limited stair units were available, and passengers would need to be escorted in small groups to the terminal. There were murmurs of frustration, a few sharp complaints from other first-class travelers. Martin rolled his eyes at their entitlement, but then caught himself. Wasn't he the same way not long ago? When the first group was called to exit, a commotion broke out further back in economy. A family with 2 small children had been told to wait, and the father was pleading with the attendants. "Please, my youngest needs medical attention for a condition. We've been traveling for 15 hours, and her medication is in our checked bag." The attendant hesitated, clearly torn between protocol and compassion. Sundar was already out of his seat. He walked past the curtain into economy and crouched down to speak directly to the family. His voice was low and calm, but firm enough that the surrounding tension seemed to pause. Within a minute, he had spoken to the lead attendant, and the family was quietly moved to the front to be escorted off first. The father's voice cracked as he thanked Sundar. "I don't know how to repay you," he said. "Just take care of her." Sundar replied simply. Martin had followed to the aisle, watching the scene. It wasn't the action itself that struck him, though it was generous. It was the way Sundar carried it out. No announcement, no need for public credit. He just saw a problem, solved it, and stepped back without leaving a footprint. Eventually, their own group was called. Stepping into the warm night air, Martin immediately felt the eerie stillness of the powerless airport. The terminal loomed in the distance, most of its windows black, save for pockets of light from emergency generators. They were guided into a dimly lit section where airport staff in reflective vests directed foot traffic. Inside, the heat was stifling without full air conditioning, and the faint buzz of backup power lights created a surreal atmosphere. Passengers milled about, unsure where to go. Some sat on the floor. Others clustered near charging stations that weren't working. The airline staff was clearly overwhelmed, trying to answer questions from dozens of frustrated travelers. In the middle of this chaos, Sundar quietly approached one of the managers. Martin saw the man's eyes widen in recognition, followed by a handshake that lingered just a moment longer than usual. Soon after, Martin began to notice changes. Small teams of staff were redirected to help the elderly and families with children find seating in a cooler section. Bottled water began circulating. Clear instructions were given over portable loudspeakers. Cutting through the confusion, it didn't take long for Martin to realize these changes weren't coincidence. Sundar's conversation with the manager had set them in motion. When they finally sat down in a quieter air, Martin turned to him. You're running this place right now, aren't you?" Sundar smiled faintly. "No, I'm just helping the people who are." "But you didn't have to," Martin said, still studying him. "Needing help doesn't wait for convenience," Sundar replied. Martin stared at him, the pieces in his head starting to connect. This wasn't just some quiet man in a sweater. There was a weight to him, the kind that came from years of leading, not by shouting orders, but by setting an example others wanted to follow. And yet Martin still didn't fully grasp the scale of who he was sitting next to, not until something happened minutes later that would erase the last trace of doubt as they waited for news on when their connecting flights might leave. A group of airport security officers entered the terminal, moving directly towards Sundar. Their expressions were serious, but their eyes carried respect. The lead officer leaned down and said something to him in a low voice. Sundar nodded, then turned briefly to Martin. "Come with me," he said. "There's something I think you should see." Martin hesitated, but the pull of curiosity was too strong. He rose to follow, unaware that the next few minutes would leave him stunned, and that his earlier insult would feel smaller than a grain of sand compared to the truth about the man he had misjudged. Martin followed Sundar through the dimly lit terminal, the air heavy with the faint scent of warm asphalt drifting in from the open doors. The officers moved with quiet purpose, parting the scattered crowd as they led the way. Martin still didn't know exactly what was happening, but the look in the lead officer's eyes told him this wasn't a routine walk. They reached a section of the terminal sealed off with temporary barriers and security tape. Inside, several airport officials stood around a cluster of backup equipment, monitors, and battery-powered lights. In the center of it all was a makeshift command hub, a table covered in maps of the airport layout, communication devices, and handwritten notes. As soon as Sundar stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations paused. Every set of eyes turned toward him, and there was an unspoken ignore expressions, a mixture of respect and relief, as if they'd just been joined by someone who could steady the ship in stormy waters. The head of airport operations, a middle-aged woman in a neon vest, greeted him warmly. "Mr. Pichai, thank you for coming. We've been trying to manage the outage, but the systems are overloaded. We could use your insight on rerouting certain network functions." Martin blinked. "Wait, you're asking him?" He didn't even finish the question. "Yes," she said matter-of-factly, "because he helped design some of the underlying systems years ago. He knows the architecture better than anyone." It hit Martin like a sudden rush of cold air. The man he had dismissed on sight, mocked, for not fitting in with first class was not just some tech executive. He was one of the architects behind the very kind of infrastructure keeping modern travel and communication alive. Sundar didn't waste time basking in the recognition. He moved to the table, scanning the diagrams, asking precise questions about the status of backup lines and emergency comms. The technical language rolled off his tongue effortlessly, yet his tone was never condescending. He explained each step so every person at the table could follow. Martin stood off to the side, watching the transformation. This wasn't the quiet man scribbling in a notebook anymore. This was a leader in his element, steady, clear, and absolutely focused on the solution. There was no ego in it, no grandstanding. It was as if his only goal was to get everyone home safely, to restore order for people he didn't even know. Within an hour, the team had a plan. Critical communications were rerouted through backup servers, allowing the airport to partially restore passenger systems and coordinate the flow of arrivals and departures. Announcements began echoing through the terminal again, clear and confident instead of halting and uncertain. When Sundar finally stepped away from the table, the head of operations shook his hand firmly. "He just saved us hours, maybe more," she said. "I don't know how to thank you." "Just take care of the passengers," Sundar replied, his voice calm as ever. On the walk back toward the main terminal, Martin was silent. He felt the weight of his earlier arrogance pressing hard against his chest. The man he had judged by his sneakers and sweater had not only saved a life in the air and advocated for a sick child's family, but had just helped an entire airport recover from a near shutdown. When they returned to their seats in the waiting area, Martin finally spoke. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice low but steady. "When we first boarded, I thought you didn't belong in first class. I thought you were less than the kind of people I usually meet there, but you're the kind of person one wished there were more of." You didn't just belong in that seat. You belong in every room you walk into. Sundar gave a small, warm smile. Apologies aren't owed, Martin. Only lessons. And we've both had some tonight. Martin nodded, but the words didn't feel like enough. He knew this flight would be burned into his memory, not because of the delay, but because it had quietly dismantled the way he measured worth. Hours later, when the airport fully powered back on and boarding resumed, Martin found himself walking behind Sundar toward the jet bridge. Several passengers greeted Sundar along the way, some with words, some with simple nods of gratitude. As they settled into their seats for the final leg, Martin glanced toward the aisle. So, do you ever tell people who you are right away? Only if it's necessary, Sundar said, adjusting his glasses. Otherwise, I like to see how they treat me when they think I'm just another traveler. Martin let out a quiet laugh, tinged with humility. Then I failed that test miserably. Sundar turned his gaze toward the window, watching the lights of the runway fade into the night. No, he said softly. You just started it the wrong way. What matters is how you end it. The engines roared, the plane lifted, and the hum of flight filled the cabin once more. Martin sat back, his mind turning over every moment of the journey. He knew he would never look at another passenger, or another person, the same way again. And somewhere in the quiet space between the clouds and the stars, Sundar closed his notebook, satisfied. The lesson had been given. Whether or not it stayed with Martin forever, that was now up to him.